Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we're looking at two passages. The first is from Psalm 34, and the second is right near the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 21. And we'll get into those passages in just a second. But I want to begin with the first of the three P's that I always use to structure these lessons. The first P is prayer. Companion of all creation, wake us up. Give us greater sensitivity to your hidden presence in all things. Help us to go beyond the surfaces of life, to experience the holiness of life, and then encounter all things with reverence and care. Amen. The second P is perspective, and I always try to give us a perspective that helps us see new things in the biblical texts that we look at each week. And today's perspective comes from poet Jan Richardson, where she talks about grieving. The sermon topic for this coming Sunday is the good life and weeping, because this coming Sunday we're celebrating All Saints Sunday, when we read the names of those who've passed away since November of 2020. And part of this process is working through our grief. So the good life and weeping. So the perspective, again, comes from Jan Richardson, who is a poet and who lost her husband. So here's how she sets it up, and then I'm going to read the poem to you that she wrote. So this is Jan Richardson. It's the dailiness of grief that I find most daunting. Morning after morning, I wake into a world that does not have Gary in it. I will never find him making breakfast in the kitchen, waiting to enfold me as we begin the day. I will never sit down across from him at the table. I will never call out to him from my studio as he works in his studio. I will never walk into the house and hear him say, "Hello, sweetheart." I will never walk out of the house with him and move together through this world, these moments, this life in the ways we so loved. And still, it is in those same moments that grace finds me. It is in those same moments that solace steals me, working its way into the everydayness that can be so daunting, but in which love still lives, waiting to enfold me as I begin the day, sitting itself down across from me at the table, visiting me in the studio, welcoming me every time I walk into the house and blessing me every time I leave it, breathing with me as I find new rhythms, new patterns, new doorways in every single day. And now here's the poem that she wrote that accompanies that setup. Sorry I am to say it, but it is here, most likely. You will know the rending most deeply. It will take your breath away, how the grieving waits for you in the most ordinary moments. It will wake with your waking. It will sit itself down with you at the table, inhabiting the precise shape of the emptiness across from you. It will walk down the street with you in the form of no hand reaching out to take yours. It will stand alongside you in every conversation, nearly unbearable in its silence that fairly screams. It will brush its teeth with you at night and climb into bed with you when you finally let go of this day. Even as it always goes with you, it will still manage to startle you with its presence, causing you to weep when you enter the empty kitchen in the morning, when you spread fresh sheets on the bed you shared, when you walk out through the door alone and pass back through it likewise. It is here you will know it best, in the moments that made up the rhythms of your day, that fashioned the litany of your life, the togethering you will never know in the same way again. But I will tell you it is here too that your solace lies. It will wait for you in those same moments that stun you with their sorrow. I cannot tell you how, but it will not cease to carry you in the cadence that has forever altered, but whose echo will persist with a stubbornness that will surprise you, bearing you along, breathing with you still through the terrible and exquisite ordinary days. So the good life and weeping this week. And it reminds me of something that writer Joan Didion once said after her husband passed away. She said, "Grief comes in waves." So that brings us to the third P, which is pieces of scripture. And we're looking at two passages that address weeping and suffering and also grief. So the first comes from Psalm 34. It's verses 1 through 6 and then verse 18. So I'm going to read them to you. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Look to him and be radiant, so your faces shall never be ashamed. This poor soul cried, and was heard by the Lord, and was saved from every trouble. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves the crushed in spirit. So the first thing to recognize when we're looking at this passage is that we're reading Hebrew poetry. And one of the characteristics of Hebrew poetry is that you often hear a first line and then a second line goes with it and repeats some themes from the first line, but often does it in different wording. So there's a kind of rhythm to the text. So let me just give you an example real quickly. Back in verse 2, you'll hear the rhythm as I read this. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. So you hear that I try to pause between the first phrase and the second phrase, because the second phrase builds on the first phrase and often restates ideas or amplifies ideas, but uses different wording. And again, it creates this kind of rhythmic sense to the poetry. So this is classic Hebrew poetry. Another feature of Psalm 34 is that it is an acrostic poem, which means that every line begins with a word that has one of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet in it. Aleph, Bet, etc. On it goes. So each line begins with a word with the first letter of the alphabet, and then the next phrase is the second letter of the alphabet, and the third letter, and then on it goes. It's an acrostic. And acrostic poems in Hebrew are fairly common in the Hebrew Bible. There are several examples of this in the Psalms, Psalms 9 and 10, 25, 37, Psalm 34, of course, Psalm 111, Psalm 112, and on it goes. There are several examples. But then outside of the Psalms, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, you also find acrostic poems. So Proverbs 31 is an acrostic. Lamentations chapters 1 through 4, these are acrostic poems, and on it goes. There are many examples of this. And there are lots of possible reasons why Hebrew poets would create acrostics. One is for beauty or aesthetics. So there's a kind of beauty to a poem when it is in acrostic form. There's also a sense of completeness to a poem. So as you work through each letter and you get to the end, it feels like the poem has said everything it needs to say. It feels complete. There's also a sense where an acrostic poem can aid memorization. So you just remember each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's kind of a cue that you'll remember the first word of the phrase, and then you'll remember the line that follows. So it aids memorization. Acrostics also showcase a poet's creative skill, because you have to be selective about which word you're choosing to start the new phrase and carry on the acrostic. So you need the second letter, and then you need a word that has the third letter, starts with a third letter, and then on it goes through the rest of the poem. And then also, finally, an acrostic poem is an aid to the hearer of the poem. Oftentimes, this poetry was read aloud or even sung aloud in the context of a congregation. So as you're sitting there, if it's, say, a cantor who's singing the psalm, you can follow the flow of the poem because each letter marks an advance in the poem until you get finally to the end. So you can follow the flow of the poetry as it's being read or sung aloud. Now, there's no possible way to translate an acrostic from Hebrew into English and have it make any sense. We just can't do it. English is a totally different kind of language in this respect. So this aspect of Hebrew poetry is completely lost to us in translation. However, there are some scholars, and Robert Alter is one who comes to mind, who really have labored at translating Hebrew poetry, really translating the entire Hebrew Bible, but specifically Hebrew poetry, to try to preserve the punchiness and the rhythm and the terseness of Hebrew poetry in translation in English. So I'm going to read to you Robert Alter's translation of verses 1 through 6 and then verse 18 from Psalm 34. So here's his translation, and listen to what he does with the poetry. Let me bless the Lord at all times, always his praise in my mouth. In the Lord do I glory. Let the lowly hear and rejoice. Extol the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name, one and all. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and from all that I dreaded he saved me. They looked to him, and they beamed, and their faces were no longer dark. And then skipping down. Cry out, and the Lord hears. From all their straits he saves them. Near is the Lord to the brokenhearted, and the crushed in spirit he rescues. I read actually a couple of additional verses in that poem. Believe it or not, the versification in the Hebrew text is different from the English text, so sometimes it's hard to read exactly what you're supposed to read when you're trying to read verses 1 through 6 in English. It doesn't translate in the Hebrew version of the poem as easily. So sometimes things get condensed and rearranged, but reading it, a few extra verses there gives us a sense of the rhythm in the poetry, which Robert Alter does a good job of, I think, of preserving. It's reading that first phrase and then reading the second phrase, which amplifies or rewords the first phrase, and then on it goes to preserve that rhythm. Now, there's one other feature of Psalm 34 that is worth noting, and that's the heading right at the beginning. So if you look at your English text, it says, of David, when he feigned madness before Abimelech, so that he drove him out and he went away. Now, there's no way to know for sure if this heading is historically accurate, if this is actually the historical context of the Psalm 34. It could be that an editor added it in. Well, certainly an editor added it in, but the question is whether that editor is preserving something that historically happened or preserving the historical context of the psalm. We can't know that for sure. So whenever I see one of those headings, I always take it with a grain of salt. It's possible that that's the historical context, but it's also possible that it isn't. Now, into the details of the psalm itself. The verses that I read, verses 1 through 6 and then verse 18, are split up into thirds under three themes. So the first theme is verses 1 through 3, and the theme is gladness and joy. So even though this psalmist has been through something that has caused weeping and grief, the psalmist begins with joy and gladness. It's joyful praise in verse 1. It's gladness and boasting in God's activity in verse 2. And then in verse 3, there's a call to fellow worshipers to exalt God's name. So the opening theme is an up theme. It's joy and gladness. Then in verses 4 through 6, we have a new theme that's introduced. It's the theme of testimony. So in verse 4, the poet says that he or she or they, depending on who wrote this poem, sought the Lord. So it's a testimony about what this poet has done. I sought the Lord. Quick footnote here. That word Lord is capital L-O-R-D in the English text. And whenever you see capital L-O-R-D, that's a specific Hebrew name for God. It's the name Yahweh. It's the name that God introduced to Moses in the burning bush story in Exodus chapter 3. I am who I am, Yahweh. So whenever you see capital L-O-R-D, it's Yahweh. It's different from capital L, lowercase O-R-D. That's the Hebrew name Adonai, a different Hebrew name for God. So verse 5 reinforces this point of seeking the Lord. And the poet seems to be referring to praying during a trying time. I sought the Lord. And who knows what the answer from God looked like. But the poet says the prayer was indeed answered. And the answer comes at the end of verse 4, where the poet says, I received deliverance from all my fears. So maybe the psalmist prayed something like, help me. Or maybe it was a prayer of release. I can't face this on my own. It's too much for me, so I release this to you. Whatever the prayer was, the seeking of the Lord, the answer was some kind of deliverance from fear or from anxiety or from something that weighed this poet down. Verse 6, the testimony continues. This poor soul cried and was heard by the Lord and was saved or delivered from every trouble. Notice that the text doesn't say this poor soul cried out to God. It just says this poor soul cried. It's tears and weeping that move God's heart to answer, according to this psalmist. Implied here is that God has such a compassionate heart and feels so deeply our own pain that our tears, in a way, become or are God's own tears. And our tears move God in a special way to action. Then the third theme is in verse 18. And really this just reinforces the idea when it says that God is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. So there's something about us being at the end of our ropes or at rock bottom or desperately sad or grieving that especially breaks God's heart. And for God to be near or close to the broken in spirit implies that God feels with them, which underscores God's compassion. Compassion is a feeling with. So this part of the psalm, verse 18, underscores this idea that God is fundamentally compassionate. All of this reminds me of a couple of New Testament passages. John 11 comes to mind, where Jesus is said to weep when he sees the weeping of his friends over his friend's death, Lazarus. So Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the New Testament. And then another passage that comes to mind is when Jesus is on the cross and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That crying out from the cross is, in a way, God's own crying, God's own tears, God's own grief and suffering. It reminds me of one section of a fairly troubling movie, The Passion of the Christ, which is all about the last few hours of Jesus' life on earth, and it's very graphic. But there's one scene in the film when Jesus is on the cross and he dies, that there's one tear that drips from heaven and hits the earth. So some theologians will actually talk about the cross as this moment when God suffered and God even experienced death. So if our suffering and our tears are God's own sufferings and tears, if God feels with us, then it helps to set the theological context for the second passage that I want to look at with you, which is from Revelation chapter 21, near the very end of the Bible. So this is a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. So this is Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. Okay, so this is such a richly symbolic text that it's hard to even know where to begin to describe it. But we can start more broadly with the overall context, the literary context of the book of Revelation. It is the Bible's most richly symbolic book. Those who say that Revelation should be interpreted literally, the locusts with the stingers like scorpions are helicopters with missiles from Revelation chapter 9. Some people actually have argued that. That's just nonsense. Each one of the symbols symbolizes something. It's talking about something else. It's a pointer beyond itself. It's not literal language, and it's not meant to be read that way. So even this passage is richly symbolic. And the question is, symbolic of what? Now, the book overall claims to be a series of visions recorded by a certain John of Patmos. This John is different, most likely different from the disciple John, who was part of the inner circle of Jesus. So this dude, John of Patmos, is a different John. And as we read Revelation, and we experience the horror of the symbolism, the torture and the pestilence and the plagues and the death, it's a very troubling text in many ways. But as we read it, we can easily lose sight of one key theme in the book, which is that this is a fiercely anti-imperial text. Revelation, and specifically John of Patmos, Revelation looks forward to the demise of the Roman Empire. This is a text that's written by a resistor. John of Patmos is a resistor of the empire. He's someone who is enraged at the destruction and the havoc and the injustice of empire, and who tells a story of the empire's cataclysmic end, and he uses fantastical language to describe it. So this text is historically grounded in probably the last third of the first century. This is not primarily a text about the end of the world. It's a text about an end of a certain kind of world, and that is a very important distinction to make. People read this text and think, it's talking about the end of everything. No, it's actually talking about an end of a certain kind of world, a world of injustice and suffering and economic inequality and imperial war-making, a world, by the way, not unlike our own in some respects. So when we wade through the violent language in the book of Revelation, it's important to keep in mind that this writer has a specific target that he's aiming at. It's empire and the injustice and violence it wreaks on the earth. So in this way, the text can really speak to any age where oppressive forces are at work and actively crushing people. So it doesn't necessarily need to be targeted at a specific empire. It needs to be targeted, or is targeted, at any oppressive force that crushes and grinds people down. Now, theologically speaking, Revelation situates God on the side of the underdog, situates God on the side of the least and the lost and the left out, the victims of oppressive and crushing forces. And it opposes violence, injustice, oppression of any kind, even though, and this is one of the challenges of reading the text, oftentimes it seems to be speaking about violence undoing violence. So in Revelation chapter 19, the rider on the white horse is spilling blood all over the place to bring the empire down, which is very disturbing language, but I think it comes from a place of extreme anger and rage of this writer. And again, it's not literal language, it's symbolic language. So there are definitely problems. The language of violence gets reinscribed throughout the book, violence to undo violence. But that's not the primary purpose of the book. The book is focused on all the oppressive forces of injustice that are crushing people, and it's promising that these forces, or it's hoping that these forces will eventually come to an end. So with this as the literary and social context, we can look again at our passage in Revelation chapter 21. And we can look at it with a new set of lenses. Again, it's symbolic language, but the writer sees something new rising from the ashes of oppressive injustice. It's a kind of resurrection passage. It's a vision of new life. And it's the kind of world that God hopes for and is working constantly through us to bring about. So Revelation chapter 21 verse 1 begins with a vision of something new. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. The sea throughout the Bible is oftentimes used as a symbol of evil or a symbol of chaos. So right away in Genesis chapter 1, God creates out of chaos. So go back and read the first few verses of Genesis chapter 1 and you'll see God doesn't create out of nothing. There is something there, but it's this kind of chaotic, watery thing that God creates out of, brings order out of the chaos. So when Revelation talks about the sea being no more, or in Revelation chapter 15, the sea is a sea of glass. It's completely pacified. What it's hoping for is the end of evil and chaos. That's the promise that the writer is looking forward to. So again, this is the kind of world that God is working through us to bring about. It's God's dream for the world, to borrow a phrase from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So in verse 1, the writer is looking forward to something new, a new heaven and a new earth. And this new heaven and new earth is going to be marked by certain traits. So we see these traits in verses 3 and 4. And again, this is God's dream for the created world. So the first trait of this new thing is that God's home will now be with mortals. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, etc., etc. That word dwell is a tent-making word. God will pitch God's tent with people. It's a tabernacle word, actually. It refers back to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness with the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was the place where God's Spirit dwelled. So Revelation is looking forward to a day when the tabernacle is not going to be local or isolated. It's going to be global. God's full presence will be everywhere. God will make God's home or pitch God's tent with all people. Then a second trait of this dream that God and this writer have is that God will wipe away every tear. So again, theologically speaking, if our tears are also God's own tears, then in a way this passage is longing for the day when even God will stop weeping. And then a final trait in this passage: death, mourning, crying, and pain will be no more. Again, if our suffering and even our experience of death, if these are God's own experiences, again, the cross is a perfect example of God's own suffering and experiencing the separation of death, then this passage is longing for a day when God, too, will be liberated from these kinds of experiences. So this is a powerful passage, not just in terms of its promises for people, but the implied theological meaning of the text is powerful as well, that the wiping away of tears and the doing away of the experiences of suffering and grief and injustice, that God too will experience a kind of liberation from this stuff. And again, this is not literal language. This is symbolic language. It's compiling a brief list of the things that cause us pain and suffering. And it's longing for a day when those things will be transformed and something new will rise like a phoenix out of these ashes. It's a hope or a dream for a day when, as Revelation says elsewhere, Revelation chapter 11, the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. It's basically a day when the phrase in the Lord's Prayer, "Let thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," when that phrase will become unnecessary because God's will be done both on earth and in heaven. So until that day arrives, the testimony or the promise of Scripture is that God will be with us. It's one of the meanings of the word Emmanuel, God with us. It's the promise in a psalm like Psalm 23, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me." It's a promise that God works to bring about consolation and healing in the midst of our pain and grief. And God does that through or by means of working through the hands and feet and the voices of others. So the closer we are to compassionate others who are supporting us during difficult times, the closer we are to God. That is God's manifestation of compassion and tenderness on earth right now. Okay, see you next week.